Can I add to that then?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add, we often use this term scaffolding when we think of learning the second and the third languages. It's like when we build a building, we have scaffolding that's in place to support the construction process until the building can stand alone. So scaffolding the learner's learning of the second and third languages means that it doesn't mean that the teacher will use the first language as a medium of instruction necessarily when teaching the second and third languages, because that's a little bit counterproductive. But it means that the teacher will not insist on the second language when the child is not yet ready to produce it. And that the teacher has to make sure that the child understands everything the teacher says in the second language. So that means providing meaningful input to the child and helping the child produce the output that's necessary to develop conversational ability in a second language. But that means that the first language is there. So if the teacher asks a question and nobody understands the question, then she has to provide some scaffolding so that they understand the second language question. Sometimes that means putting it in the first language. Sometimes that means exploring with the students what parts of the question they don't understand. Then when students respond, sometimes they can respond, but they don't have the perfect grammar in the second language, or they're missing a few vocabulary words. So the scaffolding is where the teacher comes alongside the learner and helps them fill in the gaps that they don't have. So often we see a teacher say, okay, can you say that in English? You know, when a child gives either a first language answer or you know, a partial answer. Well, if the child could do it, they would have done it in the first place. So that's when the teacher should come in and scaffold their learning so that they are successful and they produce the correct output, but the teacher is helping them to do it rather than just expecting the child to know and do it themselves.
You see how crucial the role is of the teacher then, right? And then given that explanation, what is the role of translation in MLE?
That's a good question. A lot of people just, you know, that's what the code switching was based on, right? Translate back to the first language for comprehension's sake and then move on. But really, in terms of translation, we have to talk about several different things. So the oral component of teaching and learning, and also the materials. We say for the materials that for young learners, the first materials shouldn't be translated books like Henny Penny or whatever from English, because that has no cultural context for the learner in the Philippines. It should be a story that reflects the learner, his heritage, his everyday experience, so that he can imagine himself being in that story, being one of the characters of the story. So that's why we don't want to do a lot of translation. It's not that we're withholding that, because they will be exposed to Henny Penny and Jack and Jill and those stories eventually, and we can translate those for later, but for their initial reading, we want them to engage in the story such that they can imagine themselves as being part of it. In the oral component, if we spend a lot of time in translation, then the learners learn to ignore, for example, the English that the teacher uses, because they know she's going to provide the L1.
Yes.
Right? So that means that actually their English is thwarted because they're not paying attention to what the teacher says in English. They're just waiting for the L1 component. And it takes twice as much time. So we don't want to use a lot of translation. So translation is necessary and helpful, but should be used very thoughtfully and not on a regular basis. Rather, you know, as I said, if the students don't understand something, the teacher can explore what part they don't understand, or they might have to provide a full L1 translation, but it should not be a standard pedagogy that's used, right?
But
in their
how
first
about if
language.
there's no equivalent of that particular term in the first language?
Then they should learn both, because after all, they're language learners, so they're learning Filipino and they're learning English. It's not a problem for them to learn two forms of the same academic concept. That children learn language and progress in language learning fairly well if it's done right and done well. So it's not a problem for them to learn academic content in multiple languages. The other thing I want to talk about is writing. Traditionally, in many places, writing is limited to really penmanship.
That's right.
It's how you form the letters and how neatly you can...
Psychomotor.
Yes, exactly.
But really, writing isn't talking so much about penmanship as it is about reproducing what we think in written form on paper. That's a creative and a cognitive process that has to be developed. And it can only be developed in the first language, because our second language, when we're young, our vocabulary is limited, our knowledge of how to put sentences together and phrases together is limited, and it actually becomes a barrier to writing our thoughts. So all the way through elementary school, children should be encouraged to write their thoughts and their responses to their lessons in their first language. If the teacher then wants to help them transition that into writing it, reproducing it in the second languages, that's great, and it will help develop the second languages. But if the first language is bypassed, students have a very hard time coming up with something of their own thinking in written form.
Leanne, you mentioned earlier that translation can be done, but it should be done thoughtfully. What does it mean to do it thoughtfully?